Stay back, all of you. Chief Remy Garland's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The words landed in the center of the waiting room like a dropped weapon, and every person inside Tidewater Advanced Animal Care went perfectly still. He will take your hand off at the wrist, and I will not be able to stop him in time. The Belgian Malinois at the end of Garland's reinforced lead was 87 pounds of uncut violence. His name was Phantom, and he had earned it. The tactical harness across his chest bore the worn, sand-scored insignia of a Naval Special Warfare unit that most people would never be cleared to know by name. His muzzle was caged in a heavy steel basket. His eyes were the pale amber of lit kerosene, and they swept the room in continuous paranoid arcs, checking corners, cataloging threats, finding them everywhere. His claws left parallel scratch marks in the polished tile as he spun on the lead. Remy Garland was not a small man. He stood 6'2", 210, every pound of it dense with the particular kind of controlled tension that combat operators carried in their bodies long after they came home. His jaw was set. His knuckles were white around the handle of the tactical lead. He had deployed 4 times with Phantom. He had trusted this dog with his life in places that didn't appear on publicly available maps. And right now, in a civilian veterinary clinic in Virginia Beach, Virginia, he was barely keeping that same dog from destroying the lobby. The clinic's senior veterinarian, Dr. Carl Messer, stood 15 feet away with his arms loosely at his sides, hands visible, the way you stood when you wanted to communicate non-aggression to an animal that had stopped listening to any signal except raw instinct. Messer was 61 years old and had been treating military working dogs for almost 2 decades. He was not easily rattled. He was rattled now. Chief Garland, Messer kept his voice level, clinical. I've reviewed the behavioral reports from the base kennel. 2 handlers bitten, 1 requiring stitches to the forearm, an attempted bite on the base veterinarian during a neurological exam. He paused. The command has authorized today's evaluation as a last option. If I can't find a treatable physical cause for this aggression, the recommendation for humane euthanasia stands. My team and I need to get him on the table. I know what the recommendation says, Garland said. Something underneath the flatness in his voice was stretched thin. I wrote a formal objection. They processed it and denied it in 48 hours. He yanked the lead slightly as Phantom lunged toward the reception desk, the steel muzzle clanging against nothing. Phantom deployed 5 times. He found 2 IEDs before they detonated. One of them would have killed 6 men, including me. He does not get put down in a clinic because nobody can figure out what's wrong with him. That is exactly what we're trying to determine, Messer said carefully. But I need him sedated to run the imaging. He's not going to let us near him in this state. Garland's expression didn't change. When you shoot him with the dart, his adrenaline is going to spike before the sedative takes hold. You are going to have 30 seconds of that animal at full output before he goes down. I want everyone to understand what that means. We have protocols. Your protocols were written for aggressive strays. The words weren't cruel, just precise. Phantom was trained by the Navy for 11 months before he ever saw a deployment. He knows how to fight through pain. He knows how to fight through disorientation. A dart is not going to drop him like a switch. Garland's eyes moved briefly to the door behind Messer, calculating. There has to be another way. Dr. Messer reached into the cabinet behind him and withdrew the tranquilizer pistol with the calm, practiced motion of a man who had used one before. I'm sorry, Chief. I don't see one. Nobody in the room was looking at the back corner by the supply counter. Dani Frost had been standing there since Phantom walked through the doors. She was 26 years old, 5'4", wearing standard-issue navy blue scrubs with a bleach stain near the left hem that she'd never quite gotten out. Her dark hair was pulled back in a clip that was doing its best. She had been working at Tidewater for exactly 4 months, having transferred from a small animal practice in Raleigh after finishing her veterinary technician certification. She was the most junior staff member in the building. She hadn't said a single word since Garland and Phantom came through the doors. But she also hadn't looked at the dog's teeth once. She was watching his right shoulder. Specifically, she was watching the way the rigid chest plate of Phantom's tactical harness shifted every time he lunged. The way the reinforced edge of that plate, a solid molded piece of high-density polymer, built to carry a camera mount and GPS tracker, dug into the hollow just beneath his right axilla every time Garland hauled the lead back. The way Phantom's reaction to that shift was not escalating aggression, but a specific, spasmodic flinch that he immediately converted into forward aggression because he didn't know what else to do with that kind of pain. She had seen that flinch before in a different dog, in a different city, a long time ago. Dr. Messer. Her voice was quiet enough that the first time she said it, no one heard her over the sound of Phantom's claws on the tile. The second time she said it louder, Dr. Messer, wait. Messer paused, the tranquilizer pistol at his side. He turned and looked at her with the particular expression of a senior professional who has been interrupted at the worst possible moment by the most junior person in the room. Dani, get behind the counter. I think the harness is hurting him. She stepped away from the supply station, not fast, not hesitant, just steady. The chest plate. Every time the lead pulls back, the lower edge of the plate is driving into his right shoulder. Look at the flinch pattern. He doesn't escalate when you approach him straight on. He escalates right after a lead correction, when the plate shifts. Garland's head turned toward her. The expression on his face was not hostile. It was the expression of a man operating on 72 hours of no sleep and pure adrenaline, trying to process new information through a fog. He had a full veterinary workup at the base 3 weeks ago. Full blood panel, X-rays. They didn't find anything structural. Standard X-rays are good for fractures and foreign objects with high metal density, Dani said. She took another slow step toward the dog, not toward his head. Toward his right side, at an angle, her hands open at her hips with the palms turned backward. They miss low-density shrapnel fragments, especially near soft tissue. And they miss what happens to a nerve when something small and sharp has been sitting on top of it for weeks. She kept her eyes on the floor just ahead of Phantom's paws. Can I ask how long he's been in that harness today? Garland blinked. He's been in it since 0500. I couldn't get it off him at the kennel. He wouldn't let anyone near the buckles. Because taking it off hurts as much as leaving it on, Dani said. When you're in that much constant pain, you can't stand anything touching the site. You go for whoever gets close, because close means more pain. It's not aggression, it's self-preservation. Dani! Messer's voice had dropped to a low, firm warning. That dog will kill you. Back behind the counter now. She didn't look at him. If you dart him while his adrenaline is this elevated, you risk cardiac arrest, Dr. Messer. His heart rate is already in the danger zone. You can see it in the way his flanks are moving. She was 6 feet from Phantom now. The dog had gone rigid, every muscle locked, his pale amber eyes fixed on her with a focus that was prehistoric and absolute. The growl coming from behind the muzzle was low and continuous, a sound like a generator idling before it blew. I'm not going to touch his head. I'm not going to reach for the muzzle. I'm going to try something, and I need everyone in this room to stay very still and not say a word. Lady, Garland's voice had dropped into the register he used when issuing terminal warnings in the field. I am not responsible for what happens to you if you take one more step. I know, Dani said. She stopped 4 feet from the dog. She crouched slowly until her knees were on the tile. The floor was cold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Phantom's body had gone very still in the way that predators go still right before they commit to a strike, that terrible concentrated absence of motion that meant all the energy was being gathered inward and compressed. Dani averted her eyes. Not down, sideways toward the far wall at nothing. She let her shoulders drop, made herself smaller, made herself into something that posed no challenge to anything. And then she made a sound. It was low, rhythmic. Not quite a hum, not quite a tone, a vibration in the back of the throat patterned in a slow, repeating sequence. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Thrum, thrum, da thrum. Garland went so still he stopped breathing. Because he knew that sound. He had fallen asleep to that sound in the back of cargo holds, coming out of places he was not allowed to discuss. He had heard that sound as the thing that separated the part of the mission where everything was on fire from the part where someone else was responsible for keeping him alive. It was the blade cadence of a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft in a low-speed cruise. It was the sound of going home. It was the sound that military working dogs were conditioned through hundreds of repetitions of reward and safety and warmth to associate with extraction, with the mission being over, with the fighting having stopped. Phantom's continuous growl stuttered. The sound that replaced it was not aggression. It was confusion. The rigid, coiled spring body softened at the edges, like something structural giving way. His ears, which had been pinned flat and back in the combat position, rotated forward by a single uncertain degree. His head tilted a fraction of an inch. Garland whispered involuntarily, "Don't move." Dani did not move. She kept humming, kept her eyes on the wall, kept her palms open and turned away. The sequence repeated. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Thrum, thrum, da thrum. Phantom took one step forward. Then another. The steel basket of his muzzle brushed against Dani's shoulder. Not a strike, not a bite, just contact. An inquiry. She still didn't move. He pressed slightly harder, the way a dog presses against something when it is trying to determine whether the thing is safe. She let him. The humming continued, steady, unhurried, the same slow tempo. Garland had wrapped both hands around the lead handle so hard that the bones of his knuckles had gone white. The receptionist behind the glass had both hands pressed flat against her mouth. Doctor, Messer stood with the tranquilizer pistol at his side, not pointing it at anything, not lowering it to the holster, suspended in the single most uncertain moment of his 20-year career. With a motion so small and careful it barely registered as movement, Dani raised her right hand, not toward the dog's head, not toward the muzzle, not toward anything Phantom would identify as a threat. She reached toward her own collar, scratched absently at the back of her own neck, the way a person does when they're not thinking about it, when they're relaxed and distracted, when there is nothing in the world worth being alert about. Phantom watched. Slowly the hand drifted down to his level, to the side release buckle of the tactical chest harness, positioned at the right shoulder where the chest plate met the webbing strap. "He hates having the harness touched," Garland said, his voice cracked down to almost nothing. "Heel." The buckle released, a double click clean and quiet. The chest plate swung free. What happened to Phantom in the next 3 seconds was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was the complete and total dissolution of every defense mechanism the dog had been running simultaneously for 3 weeks. The rigid combative posture didn't transition into calm. It just ended. His back legs lost their certainty first, then his front, the 87-pound Belgian Malinois, folded onto the tile floor with a sound that no hardened combat animal should make, a high, cracked whimper that broke into something almost like sobbing, a thin, continuous vocalization of relief, so profound it was indistinguishable from grief. He dragged himself the remaining 8 inches to Dani on his front legs and pressed his entire muzzled face into the crook of her neck and chest. She wrapped her arms around him and held on. The room remained silent for a long moment. The fluorescent lights kept humming. Outside, a car passed on the street. In the clinic, nobody moved and nobody spoke. Because there is a specific kind of moment that requires complete silence or it will break. And everyone in the room understood instinctively that this was one of those moments. Garland went down to one knee. He didn't make a sound. He didn't reach for the dog. He just looked at Phantom with an expression that was too complicated for anyone in that room to fully catalogue. Guilt and relief, and a sorrow that had nowhere to go, all of it crashing into each other behind his eyes. "How?" he said finally. His voice was stripped down to its foundation. "How did you know that? The cadence. Where did you learn that?" Dani lifted her face from the top of Phantom's head. Her eyes were dry, but barely. "My brother," she said. "Kyle was a Marine MARSOC handler. He deployed to Helmand Province with a Malinois named Volt." She stroked the side of Phantom's neck, away from the collar, away from the shoulder, somewhere safe. "Volt came back from that deployment acting exactly like this. Uncontrollable, aggressive with everyone, including Kyle. The base veterinarians called it severe psychological trauma from blast exposure. Irreversible, they said, not treatable." She was quiet for a moment. Garland didn't fill the silence. Kyle believed there was something physical they were missing. He filed a report 3 days before Volt was scheduled for euthanasia, requesting a contrast imaging study. He thought there might be shrapnel near a nerve root. He'd watched the way Volt moved, the way he flinched, the specific triggers. She smoothed down a patch of fur behind Phantom's ear. The report got buried in a post-action review backlog. By the time anyone found it, Volt had already been put down. Kyle found out 6 weeks later when he requested the file. A small breath. He never really got over it. Not the deployment, not what happened after. Dr. Messer set the tranquilizer pistol on the counter. He did it carefully, without drama, and he did not pick it up again. "I'm so sorry," Garland said. The words were inadequate and he knew it. He said them anyway. "Kyle taught me the cadence," Dani continued. "He used it during training to call Volt back from high arousal states, said it cut through everything. The noise, the smell, the adrenaline. Tapped into something deeper than conditioning, something the dog associated with the mission being over." She looked down at Phantom, who had stopped vocalizing and was breathing now in long, slow, normalized cycles. "I've never used it on a dog that wasn't Volt. I didn't know if it would work." The automatic doors at the entrance of the clinic slid open. The man who stepped through them was wearing a Navy working uniform, and the gold insignia at his collar identified him as a commander. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with a face that had been through weather and years, and things that left marks that were not physical. He carried a manila envelope under his left arm. He stepped into the lobby, took in the scene. Phantom on the floor, Dani kneeling, Garland beside them, Messer at the counter, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. Relief, maybe, or recognition of something he had been looking for a long time. Garland straightened. "Commander Abrams." Commander Joel Abrams held up a hand. "At ease, Chief." His gaze moved past Garland entirely and settled on Dani. He studied her for a moment with a quality of attention that was quiet but absolute. "You're Dani Frost," he said. It wasn't phrased as a question. Dani looked up. "Yes, sir." "Kyle Frost's younger sister." Something shifted in her face. "How do you know my brother?" Abrams walked slowly into the room, his boots steady on the tile. He looked down at Phantom, who registered his presence with a single low exhale, but made no move to rise. Then he looked back at Dani. "I was the commanding officer of the joint task force that ran Operation Threshold 6 years ago. Your brother's unit was attached to mine for the final phase of that mission." He paused. "Kyle pulled 2 men out of a burning vehicle during the IED strike that wounded Volt. One of those men was my intelligence officer. The other was my communications sergeant." He stopped. "Kyle got them both to the medevac point before the secondary charges went off. He applied the tourniquets that kept them alive long enough to be airlifted out." The clinic was so quiet that the refrigeration unit in the back hallway was audible. "They told my family the mission was classified," Dani said carefully. They told us Kyle and Volt were both wounded in a training accident. They gave us a flag and a citation that didn't say anything. I know what they told your family. Abrams opened the manila envelope and removed a stack of documents, some of them marked with the black bars of partial declassification. He held them out to her. These were released to me 14 months ago as part of an after-action review that I requested personally. It took me 3 years to get the review authorized. He waited as she took the papers, her hands steadier than they had any right to be. Kyle's report on Volt, the one recommending contrast imaging, is in there, page 9, dated 3 days before Volt was euthanized. There is also a field medic's notation from the day of the strike, documenting a probable foreign body impact near Volt's right thoracic region. That notation was cross-filed under a unit identifier that was reassigned in a post-deployment restructuring. It fell through the gap. He was quiet for a moment. Nobody missed it deliberately. It was just the kind of mistake that bureaucratic systems make when they're moving too fast and there are too many pieces. But the result was the same as if it had been intentional. Dani looked at the papers. Her eyes moved across Kyle's handwriting. She knew his handwriting, neat and slightly backward slanted, the way it had always been, and something in her chest unlocked that had been shut since the phone call 6 years ago that had told her Volt was gone and that Kyle had stopped talking. He knew, she said softly. He knew what was wrong with Volt. He knew, Abrams confirmed, and he tried to get someone to listen. He just ran out of time. He looked at Phantom, still stretched across Dani's lap, breathing steadily, finally, impossibly calm. When Phantom's behavioral assessment crossed my desk this morning, the symptom profile was nearly identical to what Kyle documented in his report on Volt. Same blast exposure category, same post-return aggression pattern, same trigger specificity. He reached into the envelope one more time and removed a single sheet. I drove here from Naval Station Norfolk with a request for emergency contrast MRI authorization. I was hoping to convince Dr. Messer to run the imaging before the euthanasia order was carried out. He glanced at the scene before him. It appears I was either 40 minutes late or exactly on time, depending on how you look at it. Messer stepped forward, some of the color returning to his face. The request is authorized, Commander. We have a contrast-capable MRI unit in the back wing. He looked at Phantom, then at Dani. I think at this point we can safely administer a mild sedative at a reduced dosage. His baseline is stable enough. We get him on the table, we run the imaging, and we find out what we're actually dealing with. Garland reached down, and finally, for the first time in 3 weeks, touched Phantom without the dog flinching away. His hand settled on the back of Phantom's neck, just where the fur grew thick and dark, and Phantom leaned into it. Let's find out, Garland said. The next 2 hours moved in the careful, concentrated rhythm of medical precision. Dani stayed with Phantom through the sedation process, keeping one hand on his side until his breathing slowed and deepened, and the tension drained fully from his limbs. She stayed in the observation room while he was positioned inside the imaging unit, standing beside Garland and Abrams in the dim blue light, watching the monitor as Dr. Messer worked through the sequences. The image that resolved on the screen 40 minutes into the scan was small and specific and devastating in its simplicity. Right there, Messer tapped the monitor with his pen, his voice controlled but carrying the particular weight of a man who has just had a complex, terrible thing become suddenly simple. T3 to T4 junction, posterior to the nerve root. Do you see it? That high-density fragment, roughly 4 millimeters. Low metal content shrapnel, consistent with a secondary IED casing. Standard X-rays wouldn't pick it up without contrast. He traced the scan with the pen tip. The fragment has been sitting against the nerve root since the blast. In a resting state, with no external pressure, it produces chronic pain, significant but manageable for a highly trained working animal. But when the chest plate of a tactical harness presses into the soft tissue above that site, which it does every single time the lead is corrected, every time the dog lunges, every time the handler tightens up during a stress response. The pressure drives the fragment directly into the nerve cluster. He set the pen down. The pain would be immediate, blinding, and completely unpredictable in timing. This dog was not psychologically damaged. He was being stabbed repeatedly from the outside, and he had no way to communicate what was happening or where it was coming from. Garland pressed the heel of his hand flat against his mouth. His eyes stayed on the screen. "Can you remove it?" Abrams asked. With a targeted surgical approach, yes. The fragment's location is accessible. I'll consult with our orthopedic specialist tonight, but based on the imaging, I expect this to be a straightforward extraction with a 6 to 8 week recovery protocol. Messer's voice had shifted into something quieter, more careful. He's going to need a different harness going forward. A full-body orthopedic design that distributes load across the chest and abdomen, nothing that contacts the right shoulder zone, and he'll need rehabilitation work to rebuild his trust responses. But structurally, neurologically, Chief, this dog is intact. He's been intact the whole time. Garland didn't say anything for a long moment. He stood in the dim observation room with the blue light of the monitor on his face, and the silence he held was not the silence of composure. It was the silence of a man processing a grief he had already begun to accept, being handed back to him unexpectedly, and not quite knowing where to put it. 3 weeks, he said finally, just those 2 words. "You didn't know," Dani said. She was standing just to his left, and she said it the way someone says a thing they know will not fully land but must be said anyway, because the alternative is silence. Nobody showed you where to look. Garland turned to look at her. His expression had passed through every layer of professional detachment and come out the other side into something genuine and undefended. "Your brother report," he said. "Kyle's report on Volt. It should have changed the protocol for post-blast K9 assessments. If anyone had read it..." "I know." Dani looked at the scan on the monitor, at the tiny bright fragment that had destroyed 3 weeks of Phantom's life and nearly ended it. "But it changes the protocol now. That's something." Abrams had been listening from the corner of the room. He spoke carefully. "With your permission, Dani, I would like to formally submit Kyle's report as part of the updated post-blast assessment framework that my office is developing for Naval Special Warfare K9 units. His methodology, the behavioral trigger mapping, the recommendation for contrast imaging. It should be taught. It should have been standard years ago." A pause. "His name would be credited. His findings would be attributed to him." Another pause. "It's not the recognition he deserved at the time, but it's the recognition he would have wanted Volt to receive." Dani looked at the papers she was still holding, at Kyle's backward-slanted handwriting on page 9. She thought about a phone call 6 years ago, and a dog that came home broken and didn't get to stay, and a brother who had known the truth and couldn't make anyone hear it. "Yes," she said, "he would have." 6 weeks later, the morning sun came through the clinic's front windows at a low angle and lit the lobby in a pale gold that made the space look larger than it was, softer. The tile that Phantom had scored with his panicked claws had been buffed down. The supply counter in the corner had been reorganized. The receptionist had taped a small photo above her desk, a Belgian Malinois in a blue orthopedic harness, sitting in a shaft of afternoon light, with his tongue out and his ears pricked forward and every line of his body arranged into something that looked unmistakably like ease. The automatic doors slid open at 9:14 on a Tuesday. Remy Garland walked through first, in civilian clothes for once, dark jeans, a grey pullover, the same careful posture that military service writes into a person's bones permanently. Beside him on a loose lead-long leash walked Phantom. The heavy tactical harness was gone, the steel muzzle was gone. In their place was a wide, padded orthopedic vest in deep navy blue, engineered to spread the load of the leash attachment across the dog's sternum and lower chest, Nowhere near the right shoulder, nowhere near the nerve root that had been surgically cleared 5 weeks ago. Phantom's gait was even and unhurried. His pale amber eyes moved around the lobby with the practiced alertness of a working dog, but the quality of that alertness was different now. Curious, not cornered. Present, not hunted. He found Dani immediately. She had come out from the back hallway when she heard the doors, and before she had fully processed what she was seeing, Phantom had covered the distance between them at a trot and pressed his entire substantial weight against her left side, tail sweeping in a wide, deliberate arc that cleared a stack of brochures from the low table beside him and sent them across the floor. Phantom. Garland's voice carried a note of fond, tired exasperation that had not been anywhere in his register the first time he walked through those doors. Phantom ignored him completely and pressed harder against Dani's side, turning his head to look up at her, with an expression that was about as readable as expressions get on an animal that isn't supposed to have them. She crouched down to his level. She put both hands on his face, carefully, on the sides where it didn't hurt, and he bumped his forehead against hers with a force that was slightly too much and entirely intentional. Garland crouched down across from her, on Phantom's other side. The three of them were low to the ground, in a triangle in the lobby of a veterinary clinic in Virginia Beach, and the moment was small and unspectacular and absolutely irreducible. Command approved his medical retirement, Garland said, officially effective as of last week. He'll stay with me. A pause. I've also been asked to participate in the working group developing the new post-blast assessment framework. Commander Abrams is heading it. He looked at her across the top of Phantom's head. They're incorporating a full section on diagnostic blind spots in blast-adjacent injuries, contrast imaging as standard protocol for any K9 exhibiting post-deployment behavioral changes. Another pause, quieter. Kyle's name is on the framework document. Listed as a contributing researcher, the methodology section cites his Volt report directly. Dani held very still for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small, complete motion that didn't require any words added to it. He would have been glad Phantom made it, she said finally. Garland reached out and scratched the base of Phantom's ear, in the exact spot the dog had learned to lean into over the past 6 weeks of careful patient recovery. The dog's eyes closed halfway. His breathing was slow and even and regular. Yeah, Garland said. He would have been glad about a lot of things that happened in this room.